Chapter 11. The second Quidditch match of the year pitted the Gryffindors against the Slytherins. Holly liked to sit up high where she could watch all the action practically face to face. All the Hufflepuffs were rooting for the Gryffindors with a passion. While they would have normally supported the Gryffindors, the Hufflepuff potion numbers were still low, and they couldn't figure out why. Positive the Slytherins were somehow the cause, and still angry about slipping potions to their house members, anything possibly ruining the Slytherins' day was worth it. The Quidditch game was hard-fought. Gryffindor chasers kept up a steady stream of attempts to make goals, but the Slytherin keeper, Dennis Higgs, was up to the challenge, blocking every one. The Slytherin chasers were equally aggressive, trying to score their own goals. Gryffindor keeper Lawrence Prescott successfully prevented the Slytherins from scoring time after time. After an hour and a half of intense playing, the score still remained tied at 0-0. Gryffindor players in scarlet and gold swirled swiftly around the green and silver of the Slytherins. The colors reminded Holly of Christmas, which made her think of Lizzie's art and crayon scribbles. Suddenly, Gryffindor seeker James Potter swooped down from the clouds, followed closely by Slytherin seeker Scorpius Malfoy. Slytherin beater Shirley Ogg instantly flew towards the nearest bludger and whacked it at James. The bludger narrowly missed both seekers, soaring swiftly under their brooms. Scorpius drew up even to James. The two seekers flew neck and neck with a snitch barely out of reach from their outstretched arms. Beater Martina Goyle made her way to the other bludger and sent it flying to the two. The second one flew straight at James. At the last minute, James ducked, and the bludger hit Scorpius's shoulder, breaking his grip on his broom. Scorpius managed to hang on with his legs as his body swung under the broom, but the opportunity was lost. James reached out and caught the snitch. He circled the stadium victoriously, holding the snitch up high for all to see. Amidst the cheers of the crowd, the game broke up. The final score, 150-0. That night, Holly dreamed she was on a broom, flying high in the sky, looking down upon Quidditch players zooming around, chasing the snitch. They looped and made figure eights in their chase. Their house uniforms blurred, leaving a thick line of scarlet and green colors showing where they had flown. The colorful lines remained, getting thicker and thicker as the players continued to fly, and line after line overlapped. Gradually, the snitch vanished, and the green Quidditch pitch turned to white, but the players continued to fly. Their scarlet and green lines became crayon squiggles, coloring in the white field. Somehow their loops got longer and longer until the trail of their flight took on the shape of a huge red Christmas stocking, and all the while Holly kept on hearing Becky's voice saying over and over again, "You just have to use your imagination." Holly woke before sunrise, still thinking of crayon stockings, with Becky's voice echoing in her mind. She rose thoughtfully and got dressed. Then she left the dorms, walked to the great house, and sat down at the entrance. She wrapped her robe snugly around herself, leaned against the wall, and stared across the corridor, thinking. Around sunrise, James Potter came down for breakfast with Lawrence. The Gryffindors had partied long and hard yesterday after winning the Quidditch match, but James was an early riser and liked to get things done before anyone else was out and about. He stopped when he saw Holly seated, leaning against the wall. It was unusual to find her alone without her friends. "Hello, Cuz," James greeted Holly affectionately. He hadn't had a chance to chat with her since right after Halloween, when they had all visited Hagrid. Then it wasn't much talk. They had helped Hagrid set Lulu up in Cuddle's old pen. Lulu had grown to half the size of Fang, but had pretty much chased Fang out of Hagrid's hut. James wasn't sure, but he suspected even Hagrid slept outside. Somehow Hagrid had gotten a collar around Lulu's neck. Getting her still enough to hook the leash onto it was another matter. The students circled the hut entrance with wands ready, while fearful screeching noises mingled with thuds, thumps, and shouts from Hagrid. "That's not nice, Lulu," he said frequently. "Lulu, you know better than that," was another common call, along with, "Lulu, mind your manners." Amidst all the noise, Hagrid opened the door. Lulu shot out like a rocket, only to stop short by the length of the chain attached to her neck. Then she swung wildly about, trying to break free. The 6 wizards, Holly and her friends and the Potter clan, shot spells at the swiftly moving target. A couple of the spells managed to connect and slow the cat down enough for Hagrid to come close. He picked her up and, with a chain wrapped securely around his wrist, started to carry Lulu bodily to Cuddle's old pen. Lulu recovered from the spells quickly and began struggling in Hagrid's arms. She got loose when Hagrid was halfway there. Then Hagrid had to tug and pull on the leash while Lulu tried to back away in the opposite direction, hissing and spitting with all her might. As before, her breath smelled ghastly. Huge clouds of cat breath soon perfumed the air, but Rose was ready. She had borrowed Professor Lovegood's book, Hexing with Love, the hexes people won't want removed, and found a sweet breath hex. They weren't sure how it would work with animals, but anything was worth a try. When Hagrid wasn't looking, Rose zapped Lulu with the hex. The results caused Lulu's breath to smell something like burning wet fur and rotting fish. Believe it or not, that had been a considerable improvement. Unfortunately, hexing could not blunt those sharp teeth and claws. Everyone kept their wands ready and stood out of range while Hagrid tugged. Rose also carried a full bottle of Skin Grow, in case Lulu got too close. Cuddle's old pen had no grate, so they used Wingardium Leviosa to get Lulu over the walls and inside. There was nothing quite like watching a hissing mass of mustard yellow fur floating midair while frantically reaching for something to grasp. When she was at the top of the wall, Hagrid unclasped the leash. Lulu clung to his clothes like they were a scratching post. Hagrid affectionately pulled Lulu off, and the students lowered her into the pen. Fortunately, the walls were too smooth to climb and too high for Lulu to jump over. But that didn't stop her from frequently trying. James had to admit having Lulu pace, leap, and snarl beneath them while they practiced Quidditch certainly kept the team on its toes and probably contributed greatly to their spectacular win the previous day. "What are you doing up so early?" asked James, looking down at Holly. "Just thinking," she replied pensively while staring at the opposite wall. "Anything I can help with?" "Maybe." It had to be more than just thinking. One didn't sit outside the Great Hall just to think. "Were you waiting for me?" James asked. "Kind of," came the vague reply. Translation: yes. "But why?" James smiled. "Have you eaten?" Holly shook her head. "Why don't you join us and we can talk?" "I'm not hungry," replied Holly quietly while staring directly ahead at the wall. "I'll wait until you're done." James looked at Lawrence and then at Holly. Despite her casual voice and relaxed attitude, it had to be important, or Holly wouldn't be waiting for him. And it had to be something private, or she would have shared breakfast. James had visions of Holly sitting there all day, if need be, waiting for him. James sighed. "You go on ahead," he told Lawrence. "I can eat later." Lawrence nodded and walked into the dining area. James looked down at Holly. She had wordlessly watched Lawrence leave, but was again staring at the wall. "Holly?" he asked. Holly turned her head and looked up at him. "Would you like to take a walk?" Holly nodded. James offered her a hand and helped Holly stand. Together the two walked away from the Great Hall and out the entrance. It was snowing lightly outside. James shivered a bit and wrapped his robe tighter about himself. The Great Hall was always rather cool in the morning, so he had dressed warmly. He wasn't really prepared for a walk outside, but he'd manage. "You were really spectacular yesterday catching the snitch like that," said Holly as they walked. Thanks," replied James. At any other time he would have enjoyed the compliment, but he couldn't imagine his performance yesterday was why Holly had brought him out here. "Did you know your dad once caught the snitch in his mouth?" she added. Yeah," said James. "I read that." "He said it tasted really awful, but was so excited that he didn't really notice until later," continued Holly. "I didn't know that part," said James. Sometimes Holly had the weirdest bits of information about his family. Her knowledge was all the more amazing as she had only just met the Potters last year. They continued walking in silence, heading out towards the Quidditch field. The only sound was a steady, soft crunch of their footsteps in the snow as they walked. James waited patiently for Holly to speak again. That's what his father would have done, and it always seemed to work for him. Dad was a good listener. Holly spoke again when they were well away from the castle. Your granddad Weasley seemed really nice, she said. Was this why she wanted to talk with him? Something about his granddad? He is, agreed James. How could he be of such importance that they had to speak privately? Do you remember that invention of your grandfather's? Holly asked. It looked something like a big red and white tube. James struggled to remember which one she meant as they walked. Granddad had so many inventions, but he thought he knew the one she was referring to. Yes, he replied family. What had it to do with anything? Do you know if he ever figured out what it did? I don't believe so, replied James carefully, but I haven't asked recently. Why? Why did Holly care? But Holly ignored his question and asked another instead. Your grandfather showed me a photo of his invention. It was very festive, bright red with white stripes. He was very proud of it. Are all his inventions so, colorful? I suppose you could say so, said James thoughtfully, thinking back on some of his granddad's other inventions. He likes them to stand out. But what does that have to do? And does he keep them all together in his shed where he does his inventing? They had reached the Quidditch field and had begun climbing the steps in the bleachers. Well, yes, agreed James. Grandma won't let them in the house. And the shed where he works, continued Holly. Is it a closed building or an open porch-type place? It's a porch. James stopped. He turned, put his hands on Holly's shoulders, and pulled her to a stop, too. Look, he demanded, looking into her green eyes. What's this all about? I don't know, replied Holly, turning her head away from him, not meeting his gaze. It's just that, well... Holly suddenly sat down on the nearest bench, oblivious of the snow covering it. Snow continued to fall, dotting her head with small white flakes. She began again. You remember Meg? The sudden change in topic disconcerted James. Yeah, of course. Who didn't know about Holly finding that transformed muggle? Do you know what happened? Kind of, replied James. He brushed away some snow from the bench and sat down next to Holly. Just what I read, he added. She was kidnapped, wasn't she? And then some wizard turned her into a grasshopper. Holly had clearly not wanted to talk about Meg afterwards, so they had never asked her for specific details. Not exactly, said Holly, not looking at James. Meg was fleeing the kidnapper when she said she saw Santa's toy shop. Cousin Harry said your grandfather invented a rubber duck that flew and talked, Holly added, interrupting her own narrative. Do you think a little girl might get the idea your grandfather's work area with all those colorful inventions might have looked like a toy shop? What? Of course not. I mean, James amended, they're clearly not toys. Of course not, agreed Holly, still not looking at him. She was looking resolutely at the pitch below. But you said the inventions are bright and colorful. With a bit of imagination, and if you didn't know what they were in the first place... Suddenly James felt cold all over, and not from the weather. Now he thought he knew why Holly wanted to be alone when she started talking. Are you trying to say Granddad had something to do with Meg's transfiguration just because she saw some toy shop? Began James, growing more angry as he spoke. Because if you are, you're wrong, he insisted. Nobody's kinder or nicer to little kids. He would never, ever transfigure... Of course not, agreed Holly quickly. I never said that. Meg never saw anyone. She only saw a toy shop. Besides, Mr. Tuttle said all the wizards living in the area were at Diagon Alley that day, so your granddad couldn't have done it. Not directly, she amended. What do you mean? Demanded James, still angry. Meg said she crawled into the Christmas stocking to hide, explained Holly. Afterwards, she felt real sick, and then things got very funny for her. There were lots more toys and everything seemed so big. I think that's when she was seeing things as a grasshopper. Susan says grasshoppers have something called compound eyes, where you can see a whole bunch of the same thing, Holly added as an aside. The last invention of your granddad, the red one he showed me, it's the right colors, has sort of a stocking-like shape, and looks large enough to crawl into. Your granddad told me he'd been dropping things into it and nothing would happen. Maybe it was because he never thought to drop a child in it. Of course he wouldn't drop a child in it, replied James defensively. And just because his invention is big and red doesn't mean it transfigured her. Just the thought of Granddad being somehow involved with what happened to Meg made James feel ill. What you are suggesting is impossible, he continued. Granddad's place has anti-muggle wards all around it. The whole area does. There's no way Meg would have ever seen Granddad's shed or his inventions. Prefect Gwyn says that a lot of anti-muggle wards have some sort of an emergency bypass, said Holly thoughtfully, ignoring James's protestations. It has to do with muggles focusing all their thoughts on a need for help. I should think a terrified little girl running from a kidnapper would need lots of help. I'm sure your granddad would have helped had he been home, but he wasn't. Does your granddad have an emergency bypass to his anti-muggle wards? I don't know, James admitted. But even if he did, it means nothing. You have no proof, James insisted coldly. A tight, hard knot was forming in his stomach. How could Holly even think of accusing his granddad of something like that? Assuming she bypassed some anti-muggle wards, James continued, Meg could have run into any wizard place. A lot of them probably look a bit odd to a muggle. Do you know for certain Meg was anywhere near Granddad's place when she ran from the kidnapper? No, admitted Holly softly while bowing her head. So why do you insist it was Granddad's shed that Meg ran into? James demanded. Because of what happened on the express, Holly replied in a small voice. Yeah, so Meg was on the train, retorted James angrily. I heard about that. Lots of students were on the train, too. Students who came from wizard families with wizard homes and anti-muggle wards. I thought I was mistaken, continued Holly miserably in that same soft voice while ignoring James's words. I went to your compartment, remember? You asked me to talk to Albus. I thought there were 5 people inside, but when I opened the door, I saw only 4. I closed my eyes and recounted with my mind, and there were still only 4 people. So I was sure I had made a mistake the first time I counted. Holly was silent. Her hair was covered with bits of white and melted flakes of snow dripped on her face. She wiped the water off with her sleeve. I made another mistake later in counting outside the Slytherin compartment, added Holly in a whisper. They had one too many people inside there, too. The Slytherins were their usual selves. They weren't hiding anyone in the compartment, so it had to be me. It had to be my mistake, see? But I wasn't looking for an insect. Holly looked over at James, her green eyes brimming with tears. That bug which scared Rose so, could it have been a very large grasshopper? Holly's words stunned James. He'd forgotten about that. There had been a big bug that day. Had it been a grasshopper? He tried to think of the shape behind the whirling wings. I don't know, he finally admitted. He no longer felt angry, just cold, wet, and scared. What if Holly was right? The bug flew out of the bag right into Rose's face, James explained. She screamed and dropped her bag, which landed on my foot. Everything inside went flying. When Rose finally quit screaming and got everything back in her bag, the bug was nowhere in sight, and Rose was busy blaming Albus. I never saw it again, he concluded. Mr. Tuttle couldn't figure out how or why Meg had gotten from the woods where she was transfigured to the express, spoke Holly hesitantly. Was the bag with the bug the bag Rose accidentally left at the Weasleys? The one Grandma Weasley sent by Owl the next morning? Yeah, replied James in a whisper. I think so. Do you know if Mrs. Weasley found it in the shed? No. And if she did, continued Holly, had the bag been left open? James didn't know what to say. He had no idea whether the bag had been left open, but if Rose had been using the bag, she might not have closed it afterwards. The hard knot in his stomach turned to one of worry and tension, while James sat silently thinking over Holly's words. Are you sure about all this? He finally asked. No, whispered Holly. I don't know where they found the kidnapper's car. I don't know where Meg was when she saw the toy shop, and I could be mistaken about the stuff on the train. She was silent for a moment. Then she added in a voice so soft James could barely hear her. But I don't think so. I've got to tell Dad, said James finally. He didn't like what Holly was saying, but could understand her reasons, and they couldn't be ignored. He'll know what to do. Holly nodded silently. "What'll happen?" she asked miserably. "I mean, if the invention really—" "I don't know," replied James glumly. "I've never heard of such a thing before. Wizards don't just do that kind of thing to each other, and especially not to children. But don't worry," he added, forcing his voice to sound cheerful. "If that's what happened, then it was an accident. It'll all work out okay." That last part was for himself as much as Holly. James had no idea what would happen to Granddad if that invention did what Holly suspected. The two sat together silently, watching the snow fall. Then James felt Holly shiver slightly next to him. "It's kind of cold outside," he commented, feeling rather cold himself, but not from the weather. "What do you say we go back inside?" Holly nodded. "I guess I am a bit hungry," she admitted, shivering again. "Me too," agreed James, though he wasn't. Not really. Not anymore. "And I've a letter to write," he added. James wondered how he was going to explain things to Dad. A week later, James poked his head inside the great hall and caught Holly's eye. Holly knew he had already eaten and guessed James wanted to talk with her privately. She made her excuses to her friends, rose, and joined James outside the great hall. "Want to take a walk?" he asked Holly lightly. Holly nodded and followed him out the entrance. It was still cold outside, with snow on the ground. Holly wrapped her scarf around her neck and shifted the robes around her more tightly. She'd been hoping James would come by with some follow-up information, so had been coming down to breakfast dressed for the outdoors, just in case. Holly had not mentioned their conversation last week to anyone, not even to her Hufflepuff friends. All the Hufflepuffs had speculated on what kind of a monstrous wizard would turn a little girl into a grasshopper and then leave her to die. That the wizard monster would be nice Mr. Weasley was almost more than Holly could bear, and certainly nothing she wanted to share. "I got an owl from Dad," began James when they were well out of hearing of other students. "He said to tell you that everything's been taken care of, and there's nothing to worry about." "That's good," said Holly. They continued walking. Then Holly asked, "That it?" James looked at Holly surprised. "Well, yeah," he replied. "You know Dad. He never says more than he has to." Holly nodded, disappointed. She'd been hoping for more details. Had she been right? James noted Holly's crestfallen face. "You expected more?" he asked her. "Like, was she there or something?" Holly nodded. "Yeah, kind of." She felt rather guilty for wanting to know more. Cousin Harry was as good as his word. Everything probably was all taken care of, and there was probably nothing to worry about. But still. James laughed. "That's the way I felt, too. So I wrote Mum and asked her for more information. She writes more." The two continued walking while James collected his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "Yes," he began, "the kidnapper's car was found in the area of Granddad's farm. Yes, Granddad has an anti-muggle ward with an emergency bypass. And yes, Grandmom found Rose's bag in the shed with the inventions. But no, she can't remember whether it was open or not." They walked along in silence a while before James continued. "As to the rest, nobody's really certain, at least not for sure. We can't ask Meg if she crawled into Granddad's invention because her memory's been modified, and apparently nobody wanted to test it on another child, knowing what it might likely do. So the ministry took the invention away and said they plan to lock it up. That way no one else will accidentally get into it." James cleared his throat briefly and then added, "Mum got the impression, though, that the ministry is no longer looking for mad, transfiguring wizards." "So nothing's going to happen to him?" asked Holly, concerned. "Nah," assured James with confidence. "It was an accident, something nobody could have predicted and still can't really prove. Granddad had no idea Meg had even been there, let alone gotten into his things." "That's good," said Holly with relief. "I was worried they might drag him off to Azkaban prison or something." "Nope," said James. "That's reserved for really nasty people. The ministry did suggest Granddad stick to inventing smaller items." Holly laughed. "Well, they'd be easier to hold and test if they were littler." "That's true," agreed James. "Oh, yes. Aunt Hermione's modified the emergency bypass part of Granddad's anti-muggle ward so it will alert my grandparents wherever they are the next time a muggle visits and no one's home at the time. The ministry plans to recommend other wizards do the same with their emergency bypasses. So, does that answer things better? Yes, agreed Holly, smiling. Thanks. No problem, replied James. Oh, yes. Speaking of Aunt Hermione, she gave this to Mum to give to you. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to Holly. She apparently saw it in the Muggle News and thought you might like to have it. Holly took the paper and unfolded it. Inside showed a photo of a smiling Meg posing with her parents. Proudly perched on Meg's shoulder was a tiny orange kitten. The caption says the kitten's name is Sasha, said James, looking over Holly's shoulder. I thought they modified all Meg's memories. Holly smiled. They did, she agreed, but I don't think Mr. Tuttle knew my cat's name. Holly refolded the paper and tucked it away safely. Would you thank your aunt for me? I'm really glad she sent me this. No problem, replied James. She'll be glad to hear it. The two of them turned and headed back inside. By the way, added James as they walked, though we don't really exactly know what happened to the kidnapper, we do sort of have an idea. Really? What? Well, he went chasing after Meg when she ran, right? Yes. That means he went straight into an area filled with anti-Muggle wards, ignoring them because he was really focused on getting Meg. But the first time the guy stopped to catch his breath, he would have been hit with a full blast of anti-Muggle ward thoughts like, look away, I'm late, go home, there's something I must do somewhere else, I must leave, get away, I don't belong here, caution, danger, leave. That's why he walked off without the car. The anti-Muggle wards probably made him forget all about the car and Meg. Who knows where he found himself when the effect of the different wards all finally wore off. But he'll try to kidnap somebody else, said Holly with concern. Maybe, maybe not, replied James. There were actually quite a few wizards living in the area. Some of them apparently have rather individualized anti-Muggle ward suggestions such as build a house, join a circus, visit the beach, go to the city. The closer Muggle gets to a wizard residence, the stronger the suggestion. Some Muggles actually feel compelled to do whatever the ward suggests. The kidnapper would have been stumbling around in the woods, avoiding one wizard resident anti-Muggle ward, only to run smack into another anti-Muggle ward and pick up all sorts of ward suggestions along the way. He might actually try to do everything suggested. It could take quite a while before he even remembers about the kidnapping. With luck, he'll think twice before attempting another one. I hope so, said Holly. Me too. Say, began Holly as they walked up the steps to the entrance of Hogwarts. Maybe they should look for a Muggle that's been a little muddled since September. Good idea, laughed James. I'll pass it on. And the winner for the second quarter potions count is Slytherin! The Slytherins cheered. Everyone else clapped politely at the announcement. It came as no big surprise that the Slytherins had won. They had indeed found a way to slow the other students' potion production. Upon inquiry, the Hufflepuffs learned that the Gryffindors and Ravenclaw students noticed a similar drop in their potion-making efforts. But recognizing the Slytherins had done something was one thing, and figuring out what they had done was another. Mark got the first clue by accident one day. He, Holly, and Becky had planned to go to the potions mixing room and make a potion one Saturday. Just as they were leaving breakfast, Becky nodded off. Mark sent Holly on ahead, intending to join her in the potions mixing room once he had awakened Becky. On the way down to the potion mixing room, they met Holly leaving the area, muttering something about unfinished homework. She had this glazed look on her face and had obviously forgotten all about her intentions to make potions that day. After that, Mark hung outside the corridor before the potion mixing room and observed 3 other Hufflepuff students, a Ravenclaw and 2 Gryffindors, behave similarly. It's got to be a ward of some sort, said Ben angrily when Mark reported his observations at the Hufflepuff meeting hastily called that night. So what'll we do? Protested Marcy Huckabee. How are we supposed to break it when we can't get near? Getting near may not be as hard as remembering why once we get there, added Donna. Why don't we just tell the professors and let them take care of it? Asked Carrie. Not this time, replied Clayton. If the Slytherins know we know, they'll just cook up some new scheme. As it is, we have a chance to offset it somehow. Besides, added Ben, we complain and the Slytherins will spend their free time getting back at us some new way. We're going to need more information before we can break this thing, said Gwen. Holly, talk to your cousins and see what they know, and I'll talk to Ravenda. Holly nodded. I'll make a new list of the potions we haven't done, which take the least amount of preparation time, volunteered Rupert. We're going to have to hustle once we get back into the potion mixing room. I'm caught up on all my homework, said Mark, so I'll help. Maybe there's some potions we can begin while in the dorms and complete in the potion mixing room, he added thoughtfully. Good idea. Thanks. Can anyone think of anything else? No one spoke. Very well, said Gwen. Then remember, work hard, do your best, and if we help each other, we can do anything. Holly left the meeting feeling a bit better about the potions contest. Now that they knew what the Slytherins were up to, they had a better chance of countering it. But would it be in time? The next day, Holly pulled Rose aside and told her what they had learned. Then the two of them put on the invisibility cloak and parked themselves outside the corridor before the potions mixing room to watch. The results were most illuminating. While the Slytherin students walked in and out of their potions mixing room without hindrance, the Ravenclaws and Gryffindors did not. At about 3 meters from the door, a Ravenclaw or a Gryffindor student would slow, falter, hesitate, and start to get a glazed look on his or her face. Before the students had gone 2 meters close to their respective house potions mixing door, the students would inevitably turn around and head away, often muttering something about mixed work. A few days later, the Ravenclaws quietly put up a ward of their own. An anti-Slytherin ward. While the Ravenclaws still couldn't get into their own potion mixing room, at least the Slytherins couldn't either. By the end of the week, the Hufflepuffs had developed a spell they thought might break the ward. The problem was getting close enough to the ward to break it. The Hufflepuff students who approached the potions mixing room tended to forget their purpose and couldn't remember to cast the anti-ward spell, let alone get close enough to do it. That's when Holly remembered the invisibility cloak. It had worked rather well in shielding emotions last year. Perhaps it could be used to get close enough to break the ward. Of course, it was the Potter's cloak, and Holly doubted they would lend it to just anybody. So she got Mark and Rupert to teach her the spell they thought would break the ward. After considerable practice, Holly went to James with her proposal. Early in the morning before the rest of the school was up, Holly met James, Albus, and Rose at the Great Hall. Together, they made their way quietly down to the potions mixing room corridor. When they got close, James put the invisibility cloak over Holly's head. Remember, you're invisible, reminded James. If this doesn't work, it may take a while for us to find you again. So be careful, and if you feel yourself start to fade, back up quickly so you won't forget what you're up to, and we can get the cloak back. Okay, whispered Holly. I brought Sasha along just in case, she said, pulling Sasha out from under her robes. The gray cat dropped lightly to the ground, suddenly reappearing out from underneath the cloak. I'm hoping the ward doesn't affect her, continued Holly. She'll follow along behind me using sound and scent. You can watch my progress by watching her. Wand in hand, Holly stepped towards the Hufflepuff mixing room door. Sasha followed nearby. For once, Holly found herself able to continue forward without suddenly remembering some pressing assignment she had to get done. Stand with your back against the door, advised Rose when it was clear, by Sasha's location, that Holly had passed the 6-meter mark and was still unaffected by the ward. That's the best position to break the ward from behind, and they couldn't have set the ward from inside the room. Holly reached the Hufflepuff potions mixing room door and turned around. With her back to the door, she knelt with her wand extended and carefully recited the spell. The wand glowed, illuminating the insides of the cloak. Had it worked? Holly didn't know, but it didn't feel like it. They had set and undone numerous wards in the Defense Against the Dark Arts class. That made no sound, but this was breaking a ward someone else had set up, so something should have happened, shouldn't it? How else was one to know it worked? Take the wand out from under the cloak, suggested James suddenly. He was standing with the others, well outside the 3-meter range. He had heard Holly's voice, but had seen nothing else. I think the cloak is somehow preventing the spell from being cast properly, he explained. Holly slipped her wand out of the cloak. She pointed the wand to the ground in front of her, focused all her thoughts on the spell, and again began to speak. The wand glowed again, but this time the ground crackled and fizzled and seemed to pop. Tiny flashes of light resembling lightnings or electric sparks lit the ground, starting at her feet and spreading swiftly outward like a net all around, stopping only when it reached the wall on the other side. Then there was nothing but a puff of smoke to show what had happened. "Right," said James with satisfaction. "I think that did the trick. Take off the cloak and see what happens." Cautiously, Holly removed the cloak and folded it up in her arms. She looked about while smelling the acrid scent of the dissipating smoke. "Well," asked Albus, "what do you feel?" "Fine," replied Holly. She turned and opened the door to the Hufflepuff Potions mixing room. It swung open without difficulty, and the room seemed to welcome her as if greeting a long-lost friend. Holly glimpsed a major mess inside of untended partial potions gone bad. Holly closed the door without entering and returned to the others. They would clean up later. "Okay," said James with satisfaction, taking the cloak from Holly. He turned and draped it over Rose. "Your turn," he told her. They waited and watched in silence as Rose walked up to the Gryffindor Potions mixing room door. After a while, a disembodied hand holding a wand materialized out of nowhere, and Rose cast her spell. Again, the ground in front of the door crackled and popped, sending thousands of tiny lights all across the floor, ending swiftly at the other side. When the popping died, Rose took off the cloak and folded it up in her arms. She made her way over to the Ravenclaw Potions mixing room door. Rose held out the wand and recited her spell. Nothing happened. She tried again. Then Rose looked up at the others. "I think it has to be a Ravenclaw that does it," she said finally. Holly looked at James and the others and asked, "May I take the cloak over to Layla so she can use it to break their ward?" Layla Pilkington was a Ravenclaw student in Holly's class. She'd helped Holly out in the past. It didn't seem fair that the Ravenclaws would be warded off their potions mixing room when the rest of them could enter. James nodded. "Okay," he told her. "Just be sure you get it back." "I will," she assured him, taking the cloak from Rose and hiding it carefully beneath her robes. She had class with Layla that day, and was fairly certain she'd see Layla for breakfast in the morning. As it happened, Holly missed Layla at breakfast, but that was okay, as the two shared potions class that day. Holly drew near Layla while everyone was cleaning up. "Have you guys figured out how to break the ward at the potions mixing room door?" she asked in a whisper. "Yes," replied Layla while scrubbing out her cauldron, "but we haven't figured out how to get close enough to use it." "Can you cast the spell?" asked Holly while wiping her cauldron dry. "I suppose so," replied Layla thoughtfully. "Then get the spell and meet me here at noon today," directed Holly. "I've a way for you to get close to the door." "Okay." Layla met Holly in the potions classroom promptly at noon. Professor Slughorn had already left for lunch, but Holly had secured prior permission to read some of Professor Slughorn's potion manuals in his absence. The manuals had anti-removal spells on them and couldn't be taken from the classroom. Holly often spent time in the potions classroom reading and taking notes from the manuals for ideas to use in the potions contest. Today, however, Holly planned for the two to wait in the classroom until all the Slytherins had left for lunch. The Slytherin dorm was near the house potions mixing rooms, and Holly didn't particularly want the Slytherins to know what the two were up to. When the corridor was empty, Holly secured the potions classroom, and the two stepped quietly out. They quickly made their way to the house potion mixing rooms, stopping as close as they dared before the wards took effect on Layla. "Do you have your wand?" asked Holly softly. Layla nodded, drawing out her wand. "Now," began Holly, "you can't tell anyone how you did this, okay?" Layla nodded. "Here," said Holly, pulling out the cloak. "I'll put this over your head and you'll be able to get to your door. Just make sure your wand is outside the cloak when you cast your spell." "Is that what I think it is?" asked Layla, staring with wide eyes at the silky gray material. "That depends on what you think it is," answered Holly, unfolding the cloak. "It's an invisible cloak," pronounced Layla with excitement, fingering it wonderingly. "I've read about them, but have never actually seen one. Where'd you get it?" "Can't tell you," replied Holly shortly. "I don't know if we're supposed to have this, and I don't want anyone to get into trouble." She draped the cloak over Layla's head. Layla vanished immediately. "Just be sure you give it back when you're done," added Holly, looking in the direction where she'd last seen Layla. "I will," came Layla's familiar voice. Holly listened to Layla's soft steps head off and waited. Then she saw a hand waving a wand appear next to the Ravenclaw Potions mixing room door, and heard a soft mumble of words. Again, the floor seemed to crackle and pop, and little sparks of light spread out across the surface. When it stopped, Layla pulled off the cloak. "That was neat," she said cheerfully, Her hazel eyes sparkled. She handed the cloak back to Holly. "Thanks." "No problem," replied Holly, folding the cloak and putting it away. After that, potion productions began in earnest. The Hufflepuffs came close, but it wasn't enough to offset the head start the Slytherins already had. Rumor had it that Mr. Borish and Professor Slughorn had difficulties remembering their purpose whenever they tried to go down the corridor to judge the entries at the end of the quarter. Finally, Headmistress McGonagall and Professor Lovegood had to be called to help break the anti-Slytherin ward. Professor Slughorn had been heard to loudly consider lodging a complaint on behalf of the Slytherin students, but as the Slytherins had clearly won the quarterly count despite the ward, he apparently decided against it. No one would say who had set the ward, so Professor Iverson, Professor Longbottom, and Professor Flitwick all sternly lectured their respective houses about the consequences of cheating and deducted house points. New magical protections were installed to prevent any future attempts at wards outside the potions mixing rooms. "Oh, well," sighed Gwen when the Hufflepuffs met for their last house meeting before the holidays. "The potions contest isn't over yet. Next time."